Us now is Dr. Scott Gottlieb. He's the former FDA Commissioner, a CNBC contributor, sits on the boards of Pfizer and Illumina. A lot to talk to you about the virus, but first to react to this news, Dr. Gottlieb, 4 orders. A lot of them have been bandied about for a while. Anything here that would surprise pharmaceutical companies?
Nothing surprising. These executive orders have been in the works for a very long period of time. They were drafted literally more than a year ago. I think the significance of these is that they set up the next political debate. They're unlikely to have an immediate impact. These have to be executed by the regulatory agencies. That would take time to issue regulations. This is going to be tied up in court. And the regulatory agencies are distracted right now anyway, dealing with the public health emergency at hand. But I think the significance here is that this sets up the political debate in the next political cycle when, the Congress comes back to dealing with drug pricing legislation.
Yeah, which might be an odd place to be in the middle of a pandemic when we need these companies, Dr. Gottlieb. Just for an update on the virus trends, a lot of charts were making the rounds on Wall Street trading desk and in research notes this morning showing hospitalizations, one chart showing that they peaked and they're starting to come down. Have you seen that in the data, or is it too hard to figure out now that different states report these kind of numbers differently?
Yeah, I think what you're seeing in the data is that cases may be peaking in some of the hotspot states. So Texas, Florida, Arizona, Southern California is different. They still seem to be growing the number of cases. But in those other states, which are really the epicenters of the epidemic spread right now in the United States, you are seeing trends that the cases may be peaking out. I think hospitalizations can continue to rise for a period of time because there's a delay in time to hospitalizations. And also deaths are probably tragically going to continue to rise for a period of time as well. But there are some indication that the epidemic in these states is starting to slow. These models follow Google mobility trends data pretty well. And so when you see people starting to mask up and withdraw, starting to do less, go out less, that's a good indication that you're going to peak out in the epidemic. And that's, in fact, what the models are showing right now. We talked about a couple of weeks ago being, 2 to 3 weeks away from a peak in this. And that's probably where we are. Now, it's likely to be an extended plateau, however. We're not going to come down these epidemic curves very sharply. We're likely to plateau at this number of cases for a period of time right now.
Dr. Gottlieb, the debate about whether kids should go back to school or not rages on. I was wondering whether you thought it was fair to differentiate between crucial and less crucial activities. For example, not allowing indoor gatherings for dining, but maybe it's a risk worth taking for schooling if schooling is that much more important.
Well, look, I think it's important that we differentiate activities as a community. If we want to open our schools and we prioritize that, we have to think carefully about whether we're going to allow bars or indoor restaurants to open. We also have to prioritize what we do in school. And so extracurricular activities, sports, those are things that probably should be put on hold while we try to reopen the schools and prioritize in-class learning as we reopen the schools. But certainly at a community level, the first thing you need to do to be able to reopen the schools is get the spread under control. It's going to be very hard for communities to open schools for in-class learning against the backdrop of really epidemic, uncontrolled spread. And so you need to have the spread under some measure of control before you can safely contemplate opening schools. The good news is a lot of parts of the country, the epidemic is under some semblance of control, certainly here in the Northeast. And I think those states are going to have the opportunity to try to open their schools in the fall, at least for a period of time.
I wonder if you would recommend to these decision makers, the governors and other local authorities on opening schools, whether it matters by age range. What does the data show about school for teenagers, for instance, versus younger kids in terms of how likely they are to contract and to transmit this disease?
Well, it looks like kids across the age spectrum are less likely to contract the disease, or at least develop symptomatic disease. But there was a big study out of South Korea about a week ago that showed kids between the age of 10 and 19 were just as likely to transmit the disease when they did become symptomatic. Now, it was a small sample because there weren't a lot of kids who developed symptomatic disease. But for those who did, they were just as likely to transmit it, if not more likely, than an adult. What we also don't know is what the consequences are. Now, a lot of people say that there is no significant evidence that kids are having major consequences from COVID. The actual incidence of hospitalizations and deaths, thankfully, is low. But the reality is that most kids probably haven't been infected with COVID. There's comparisons in the CDC document that came out last night to flu, and noting that, rather grimly noting that the number of flu deaths far outweighed the number of COVID deaths in the pediatric population, which is true. But the reality is that flu last year infected 11.8 million kids. We have not infected anywhere near that number of kids with COVID, and we don't want to find out what it might look like if we did. We really do want to prevent outbreaks in this school setting.
Dr. Gottlieb, clearly tensions with China are escalating over the last week or two. To what extent do medical supplies in the U.S. rely on supplies from China still?
A lot. We have not been able to, change the global supply chain. This is going to take some time to do this. China just started to flow back into India a lot of the active pharmaceutical ingredients that go into drug manufacturing. So there were reports out of India in the last 48 hours that India is now getting the full supply of active pharmaceutical ingredient from China after China shut down some of those flows to try to husband those resources as they dealt with their own public health crisis in that country. So there is an indication that the global supply chain, at least as it relates to China, sending supplies around the world is getting back to some semblance of normal. But we're still very dependent upon China for a whole host of medical supplies.
Dr. Gottlieb, what is the prognosis for what these curves look like? And I wonder if the mask mandates in certain states will start to show a leveling off and a decline of the curves. Because if you look at everywhere that's been successful around the world and in this country, like New York, it was nearly total shutdown that crushed the curve. So what then do we expect in places like Florida, Arizona, and Texas, which are not shutting down?
Well, look, I think what we can expect really is a continued burn. I don't know that we're going to get the infection levels much lower than where they are right now. Even if states like Texas or Florida get it under a better measure of control and you start to see cases go down, we're seeing other states heat up. Ohio has a big outbreak right now. Georgia, Missouri, Kentucky, Illinois, cases are starting to trend back up. And so I think what we're likely to see is a rotating series of regional outbreaks and epidemics around the country, really through the fall and winter. And that's the challenge. We have so much infection in this country right now, it's going to be hard to crush the virus. I think that states that implement pretty stringent measures around what they allow, indoor dining, for example, in bars, states that have better adherence to universal precautions like mask wearing, I think those states have a better shot at keeping the epidemic under control, not having it get out of control. But there's going to be reintroductions even into states like Connecticut right now, the state that I'm in, where the infection rate is very low. It's inevitable that the virus is going to come back. I think by taking these measures, you can perhaps keep it at bay, and that's what we're hoping for.
Dr. Gottlieb, thanks for joining us.